Hi, I'm Stephanie Lemick, and this is Building Trauma-Informed Workplaces. I am thrilled to have another amazing individual joining us for another great conversation. And this one's a little different. This one was even a little uncomfortable for me at first, which is fun, but it's also so important, especially as we think about being trauma-informed, being open and accepting of everyone's journey to get out of our comfort zones and learn about new things. And I am so glad I had a chance to hear our guest, Steven, speak at Transform this year and talk more about psychedelic coaching or psychedelic assisted coaching. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Because this is something that was new to me, I am excited for our listeners to get a chance to learn more about it. So, Steven, thank you so much for joining us. And I would love it if you would introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Stephanie. If you were at Transform learning about psychedelic assisted coaching, I was at Transform learning for the first time that their organizations focused on building trauma-informed workplaces. So it's really serendipitous that we had a chance to cross paths. My name is Steven Huang. I am the Director of Social Justice at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I'm also the founder of my own side consulting business called Set the Setting, which is an organization that focuses on the intersection of HR, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and psychedelic thinking and psychedelics. I've been working really in those three spaces, in human resources, DEI, and psychedelics for the last decade. And in my role at MAPS, which is a full-time job, I get to do all those things. I get to do HR work and DEI work, not just internally, but externally, and how we think about policy for one of the world's most preeminent psychedelic organizations. I've always been sort of an out-of-the-box thinker, someone who likes to think at the systems level, someone who likes to challenge the status quo. And so it's, I guess, not surprising that I find myself at this sort of cutting edge intersection of what all of these three things could be.
I love it so much. And we were talking before we started recording. I actually ran into MAPS when I was in Vegas a couple weeks ago. My husband and I, many people who listen in, many people may not know, also that my husband and I are deadheads. So we went and saw Dead and Company at the Sphere, and the Dead always do a great job making sure to share information, share some great organizations, different groups. And I ran into MAPS there, and I was so excited. So it was so amazing. It's so cool to see how long some of this work has been going on, and how many people have already had a positive impact around, psychedelics and what they can really do. So, to learn a little bit more about you, I would love to know, how you got into this space. And then I'd also love to know, why are you excited about psychedelic assisted coaching specifically?
Yes, great question. Okay. I got into psychedelics the same way a lot of people got in, which is just through like experimentation and just kind of like the social recreational use in college. And that's when I first kind of discovered psychedelics. And back then it was just, oh, wow, that was quite an experience. I was just like, I got to see a different reality and experience in an out of body, out of mind moment. And you don't really know what to make of it. I don't know, in your first few times, maybe when you're not being that conscious or intentional, just this thing. I kind of let it go for a few years and let my career take off. And just ever since I discovered MDMA, which was a little bit over a decade ago, maybe 11 or 12 years ago, I've found that psychedelic thinking and my career have always kind of intertwined and crossed over in these interesting ways. As an HR and DEI person, psychedelics have helped me, like I said before, challenge the status quo, but also imagine new solutions. Like I'm not stuck to what's been done before. Psychedelics can kind of like help you think differently, expand your perspectives. Like, let me try this other thing, or how come no one's tried this? And so I've always been, not super forward about my psychedelic use, but people are always like, how'd you come up with that really creative strategy? Or how are you like coming up with these ideas? And I'm like, I like to get creative sometimes. And I know a lot of people smoke cannabis for that kind of creative thinking as well. So I eventually got into the space. You know, the day that George Floyd died, was killed, I just had a moment of like, I really want to do really meaningful, purposeful DEI work. And I don't want to do performative DEI work or help companies think that they're changing, but they're really not. Like, I really want to be able to push people harder than I was able to do. And I just had a moment where it's like, you know what? I really want to bring psychedelics into the DEI world. And then the more I looked into the psychedelic space, it's like, well, I actually think I need to bring DEI into the psychedelics world, because the psychedelics world was pretty homogenous in a lot of ways. And I was just experimenting with this intersection. It took me about a year to update my LinkedIn to say, hey, I want to work in psychedelics and I want to do DEI work in psychedelics. And putting yourself out there was, you know, a big, scary move, but it paid off. And people found me, and I started to kind of like what you're doing with the Wounded Workforce, just put it out there. Hey, I believe in this, and you'll find people that believe in you as well. And lo and behold, here we are.
You know, it is scary. It is scary to kind of, I don't even want to say walk on the edge, but just get so outside of the box of what people are comfortable talking about at work.
Yeah.
I am sure you had similar conversations. I've had conversations with peers of mine who've been nervous to talk about psychedelics, their own experience. They're like, oh, is this going to turn people off? And I'm like, the people who aren't for you, it'll probably turn off.
Yeah.
And one thing for me that I say over and over again, part of the reason the Wounded Workforce, this work I'm doing, even exists is because I just want to define something about trauma-informed workplaces. And because so many people are afraid to actually use the term, I couldn't find it. Yep. And so to me, it's like, how disingenuous would it be to call it something different to make it more palatable? And I think, again, it gets to what you said earlier about, I don't want to do the check the box work. I want to do the real change work.
When people ask me like, oh, how did you get into DEI work? I wanted to tell them the truth. Like, psychedelics helped me get into this work and inspire me, but I was being disingenuous. It's like, oh, you know, I've always been inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. It's true, but it was the psychedelics that really helped me, give me the courage to be like, this is my passion and this is what I want to do.
I'm so excited. I'm always so excited, like the people I get to meet, and like, I'm so glad we met. It's like such kindred spirits. So I'm a big definition girl. I'm a big, let's get on the same page. Let's create a shared sense of understanding. What is psychedelic assisted coaching?
Okay, well, this is going to be a little uncomfortable for you because it's undefined. There's a messy middle.
Oh, sure.
So if we wanted to find psychedelic assisted coaching, let's back up a little bit. There's the psychedelics use that I talked about early in my life, just recreational, social, unstructured, in a forest, hugging a tree, that kind of psychedelic use. On the other end of a spectrum, it's a highly controlled clinical environment, certified therapist, maybe even a nurse. You're in a clinical setting. You're in there to treat PTSD or depression or anxiety or something like that. Those are two, I think, common things that people think of. Psychedelic assisted coaching is somewhere in this big, messy middle between those two things. So one common application that we're seeing today is that people are doing psychedelics and they want some coaching around, hey, I had this thought during a psychedelic trip, or I'm working on this thing, therapy, or you know, some sort of aspect of my personal development, and I'm doing psychedelics. Can you be a coach to help me through this process? Another version of psychedelic assisted coaching is where the coach is actually administering or giving psychedelics to someone as part of a coaching program. Oftentimes it's a microdose, so it's just something to kickstart maybe a little neuroplasticity, but it's still undefined. Psychedelic assisted coaching, I mean, there's still no certification body. There's still not a lot of like people that would, you know, publicly call themselves psychedelic assisted coaches. It's still a very elementary nascent field.
I mean, I love that there's so much space around it, and it makes sense. I mean, even when you just talk about coaching means a lot of different things, and it's kind of the wild west of coaching is a lot of times what people say. But it's so I love how you describe kind of the messy middle. You know, it's somewhere between this very clinical experience and, you know, out in nature hugging a tree. What an image. I love that so much.
One
Um,
time I was out hiking and my friend's like, I don't know, we just took a little bit of mushrooms. He's, do you think it's working? And I was like, well, let's hug this tree and see. And as we were hugging it, we're like, I think it's working. It was just there. And I was like, this is nice.
oh, I love that. That's amazing. So, I mean, when you think about psychedelic assisted coaching, you know, what are some like exciting applications or, you know, what are some exciting areas that you're looking forward to exploring? You're excited to see more people explore in the future as this expands and maybe gets a little more defined for us definition girls over here.
Sure. Psychedelics. And this is actually one of the interesting intersections with talking and thinking about trauma. As you know, trauma can be really difficult to approach, right? Like there can be a lot of shields up, a lot of protectors up that are really protecting us from something that may have been really emotional or triggering or, you know, really harmful in our past that we're like really not afraid to approach. Psychedelics can help lower the barrier to addressing some of those really scary or traumatic memories. And so the way that I'm thinking, and a lot of people are talking about psychedelic assisted coaching, is in a work context, we often have trauma related to work, either a toxic work environment that just really took a toll on our mental health, or maybe we had a manager who, you know, bullied or harassed or just had this really difficult relationship with a leader. If we don't address some of those really difficult traumatic memories that you know happened in a past work experience, that can carry with us to future work experiences. And then maybe we are triggered when our manager says something, or maybe we're not bringing our authentic selves to work because it hurt us in the past. Psychedelic assisted coaching, one application could be getting people the ability to talk about and process some of those difficult memories in the past, repackage and repurpose those memories into something more useful, get closure, and then be able to show up at work or as a leader in a different way.
I love that so much because I think one of the biggest things, I mean, even my own personal story, my own connection to trauma-informed workplaces is me having a therapist work with me for years. And as part of that, recognizing that my trauma responses were showing up in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And here I was, a HR executive, and I did not realize or recognize without assistance of a professional for many years that here's this trauma that's showing up for me at work.
Powerful.
And it's so powerful. And I think about, you know, when we suppress memories. I have suppressed memories, and your body, you are still reacting. And those reactions can show up in the workplace. What a powerful way to understand yourself better and have greater control over your own reactions. It's so amazing to me because when you think about access to different forms of mental health support, it is challenging out there. Finding a therapist, getting access, sometimes you're not connected with the right therapist, the right form of treatment. Sometimes that's not enough. What about medication? Just like I always describe trauma as a snowflake, it's so unique to each person. I think everyone's healing journey is also a snowflake. So the more we can explore different resources, the better we do actually supporting a more trauma-informed world.
Yeah. You get it. I hope that resonates with the people listening.
Yeah.
You know, if you can think back to a moment that maybe is really, you know, a really difficult or challenging moment in your work career, and what would it be like to be able to process and get closure? You can kind of imagine just making sure that different tools exist for you to be able to do that, and the impact that it could have downstream for you and for your coworkers around you in your career.
Amazing. Absolutely. So this is like, I'm excited. I'm excited for all my questions, but this is maybe my most exciting question for me anyway. I'm excited about it. But tell me about some common misconceptions that you'd like to dispel about psychedelic assisted coaching, psychedelics in general.
Okay. Well, a lot. and I wouldn't call all of them misconceptions. Well, okay. I guess all of them can be categorized as misconception. One thought behind psychedelics is that like it's the psychedelic itself that can unblock you and create this ability to transform your trauma into something more useful. The psychedelics are a tool that like lower the barriers for you to do the work. Taking psychedelics on their own likely will be much, much, much less effective than what we would maybe refer to as psychedelic assisted coaching. The psychedelics may, flood your brain with serotonin and dopamine. Like, okay, now I can actually really talk about that toxic manager without getting triggered. And then you and your coach can work through those difficulties. So it's like you still have to do most of the work. The psychedelics are going to assist you, but it's psychedelic assisted coaching. So we always talk about how psychedelics are often seen as like this magic pill or this silver bullet. And that's probably the biggest misconception, is that psychedelics really just are a tool for people to be able to work through some of these difficult things, much like some people might think like mindfulness or other kinds of coaching. It's just a different strategy that you can use, one that maybe I find to be powerful, but people don't really have access to. I should also say that psychedelics don't work for everyone. Not everyone is a good candidate for psychedelics. Different psychedelic compounds have different side effects and different what we call contraindications. Like you shouldn't be taking some psychedelics if you're on SSRIs, for example. So, if you're getting really excited listening to this podcast, you're really willing and ready to jump in, you have to do your research and you have to talk to people and be really careful about how you approach it.
I mean, it makes so much sense. It's a tool, and it's, similar to, I take medication for my anxiety and depression, and I've taken it twice in my life. So the first time I did it, I just was like, I just need something to take the edge off. It was 2016. You guys can jump to your own conclusions there. But I was like, I need something. And my physician, she prescribed me something. She's like, yes, very clearly you're exhibiting signs of pretty severe anxiety. So I took medication, and then I started to feel more normal, better, and tapered off. And I'm like, okay, I don't need this now. Yeah. And then I'm very triggered by world events, I guess, because then 2020 rolled around and I'm like, I need some more help. I need some support. And I did something different. I was like, my doctor had encouraged me to go to a therapist to engage in talk therapy. So I was like, okay, I didn't do that last time with this medication. I'm going to do it now. And so I started doing talk therapy, and it got to the point where I also, needed another medication. So I started taking the medication again. But like you said, these were tools for me to do the work. Because when I just took the medication, I was like, okay, that picked me up. I'm better now. Spoiler alert, I was not. It was just kind of a Band-Aid and helped me get through, a period of time. But instead, engaging in these ongoing practices, using these different tools works much better for my overall health. And to me, what you're saying is perfect. I don't think there's anything out there that is the magic pill for, dealing with challenges, mental health, physical health. It's not out there. We would love it if it was, but there are these amazing tools that when used correctly can be just absolutely just life-changing. So I'm so excited that this is an option for folks to
I love
explore.
your framing, Stephanie.
Yeah.
I love this framing of like, and thank you for sharing your personal story. It's
Oh,
like,
of
hey,
course.
we all need tools and help from time to time with various things. And we all, coffee is technically a psychoactive substance. It changes the way your brain thinks and the way your heart beats and how quickly you breathe. Some people need a daily ADHD medication. Some people need an accommodation for their ergonomics, just for how they work. Humans have been figuring out things to do to help them be more productive and lead healthier, happier lives from the get-go. That's why it's so interesting with, there's a lot of hesitation around psychedelics, but actually a lot of psychedelics are actually in nature. There's over 200 psychoactive plants. Psychedelics have been used by indigenous communities for millennia. And before the war on drugs, which was really just a reaction, psychedelics were being used in therapy. They were being used in coaching contexts, different ways. And it seemed to be working well. Psychedelics were being researched in some ways back then. There was a crackdown in the 70s and 80s with the war on drugs, which was actually a very racist war on drugs, as we're now realizing now. I think we knew it back then too. But now psychedelics are kind of like making this resurgence, and these kinds of conversations are happening. And I think it's really important that we are having this conversation. I don't like this term of like knowledge workers, but like white collar jobs are like exploring this idea. And I think that's going to do a lot for mainstreaming the psychedelic movement.
Absolutely. I want to talk about the war on drugs being racist, because I think it is this really interesting intersection that you point out. And it gets to something that, I don't consider my work in the DEI space. I think it's a happy partner to DEI. And part of that's because, I'm a cisgender white woman. I don't know that my voice adds a ton to the discourse around DEI at this point. But trauma-informed workplaces have to be informed around historical, gender, cultural issues. Otherwise, you're not trauma-informed. That's DEI. And you said it so beautifully when you said, I want to bring diversity, equity, inclusion into psychedelics because it's quite homogenous. Part of the reason, I'm going to take a wild guess here, I think it's an educated assumption, we'll say that part of the reason psychedelics are so homogenous is because the war on drugs was racist.
Yes. Absolutely. Nailed it. Yeah.
And I talked briefly about being a deadhead. I'm a deadhead as an adult. As a teenager, I remember, seeing the Grateful Dead stuff and going, oh, those are the drug kids. And it's, a more diverse crowd than it was going to shows, even just like 10 years ago. But there's a very specific demographic that shows up and I don't think appreciates, whether it's psychedelic use, whether it's cannabis use, the disparity in impact based on race, based on socioeconomic status. Mostly based on race, truly.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important to do the work to kind of roll back where, a rich upper class white man maybe has been exploring psychedelics his entire life. That's great. I'm so glad that it has a positive impact for you. But the risk in engaging in that behavior is so much different than for a Black woman, for example. So I think that intersectional thought process around psychedelics is so important here. And that's why normalizing conversations about it is also so important.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for double clicking into that. Like if you want to be a part of the psychedelic movement or even take psychedelics yourself, it's really important to be a trauma-informed psychedelic user and to recognize that, the reason that the psychedelics space is so kind of homogenous is to get it started. you had to be willing to break these laws and rules. And so a lot of white men, Timothy Leary, the founder of my organization, Rick Doblin, are white men that have the privilege to be able to be like, you know what, I stand for this, and I'm going to create space for others. I don't think those, early initial psychedelic pioneers could have been Black people.
No.
Like there was just too much racism embedded into the war on drugs that they would have not been taken seriously. They would have been criminalized, pathologized, what have you. One of the early examples, and cocaine is not a psychedelic, but the war on drugs, the criminal penalties and the federal minimums for crack cocaine was 100 times higher than powder cocaine, even though it's the same molecule. But white people used powder cocaine and Black people were using like this cheaper crack cocaine. Mm-hmm. And those disparities existed for a long time. And it was really just to criminalize and destroy Black communities. When you put Black people in prison, it impacts their families and their communities and their ability to build wealth. And so we're still reeling from the war on drugs is still going. I mean, we all recognize, I think most of us recognize that it failed and that it was racist. And it's failing. People, drug use is higher than ever. So I think we're finding that with abstinence only sex education, the prohibition strategy, those things really don't take into account human behavior.
And I think too, we look at the war on drugs, we look at, illegal drugs. Look at what has been probably the most devastating drug in recent decades. It's opioids. Mm-hmm. And that is a prescription medication that is legal.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really hard and it's really important. Like, I shared with you, I'm from Nebraska. I was not prepared for an adult life where I was having conversations in an educated manner about psychedelics. But I think it's so important for us to let go of some of those things we're told and really have a more intersectional, a deeper understanding about some of these things, because like most things, boiling it down to drugs are bad, say no, like that's not enough information.
Yeah.
That's not really informing us in the right way.
Yeah.
Because I just said I take drugs for my mental health conditions and it helps me immensely. It is a prescription drug. Mm-hmm. How can we kind of navigate those differences in a informed and educated way?
Yeah. And I think part of that is recognizing that everyone's in a different place in their journey. Mm-hmm. And so like I have these pretty radical thoughts on drug policy, as you can imagine. And part of my process is figuring out, okay, where are people at? And I think you can't jump too far ahead.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you some of my thoughts later, but I think it's important to start with okay, let's open people's minds, right? Like you're opening people's minds on your podcast by saying, take drugs for mental health. Mm-hmm. And there's absolutely no shame in that. There shouldn't be. I often, if someone is really new to this conversation, maybe if they're of our generation, they were in the DARE program growing up, right? And I even have a picture of myself wearing my DARE shirt to picture.
DARE t-shirt, yeah.
The same years that DARE was going on, the sales of Oxy went from 20 million to 1 billion.
Yeah.
And so it's if you have this stigma around psychedelic drugs, like you should with all stigma, is approach that with curiosity. Yes. Where did that come from? Who taught me that? What were their motivations? Is that information still relevant or useful for me? A lot of the drug education that's being popularized now is not no drugs, like NO drugs, but no drugs, like KNOW, no drugs. And then we're encouraging parents to hey, have more honest conversations, strategies don't ask your kid if they use drugs, but ask them if their friends use drugs. And there's a way of getting around that. Don't do a 60-minute conversation, do 61-minute conversations, single-minute conversations. So there's all these strategies that are so much more human and realistic. Yes. And fostered in understanding and not stigmatizing.
Absolutely. And I think too, something you said earlier that's so important to this conversation, because I think about, I do a lot of work with folks in the construction industry. I do a lot of work with folks who are recovering from addiction. You said this perfectly. Psychedelic assisted therapy is not for everyone. And it's about knowing if you're the right candidate and what compounds work for you. I think that's such an important distinction because while I may never say, oh, psychedelic assisted therapy is correct for me, psychedelic assisted coaching is right for me, I also never plan on taking a parental leave. It doesn't mean that we can't advocate for these things that benefit others. And then, honestly, these things that benefit others end up benefiting us all by
Yeah.
creating better workplaces and better societies. So I think it's an important nuance that even if you're like, I don't know that I'd ever want to do this, that's okay. But learn more, understand more, have that curiosity.
Mhm.
So maybe you feel a little bit different about other people having access to something that can be really transformative for them.
Yeah, that's a really good like point. Is psychedelics are not going to be for everyone, but I still come across some people that are like, oh, psychedelics are like bad for everyone. I'm like, you're wrong. Like, there's plenty of people that psychedelics have benefited from. Plenty of testimonies and stories about there, especially from veterans.
Yes.
That have been using psychedelics. And so, that's one application that I think is just super important and really hard to ignore. But you're right. I mean, if you think about like the disability movement, what's often good for people with disabilities often benefit everyone.
Yes.
The reason we have curbs with little slopes in them was for people with wheelchairs originally for mobility issues. But now it's like anyone that's ever tried to bring a piece of luggage or a stroller like through a city, like, called the curb cut effect. What it's often good for a minority can often be good for the majority as well. One of the most enlightening things for me was I went to a psychedelic retreat center that was focused for like on leaders and entrepreneurs and executives. And this is a few years ago. I maybe identified as an executive, entrepreneur, leader. Like, I don't know. I've never held like a C-suite position before, that kind of thing. But in this experience, there were a lot of very successful CEOs there. And I guess I was surprised, although I shouldn't have been in hindsight, that a lot of them had trauma from their childhood. And a lot of them, I intuited or they expressed was that being a CEO was a way to like work past their trauma or really press down their trauma. Mm-hmm. That if they were a successful CEO, that they would be worthy of their parents' love, mm-hmm. that they would have the safety and security that money provided, mm-hmm. these things that they didn't necessarily have as children in their environment. And it made me realize some of our leaders, the people that set the tone and the policies for their entire workforces and downstream and their industries and communities, likely have this unaddressed trauma that's rolling down to all of us.
Oh, yes. And one thing I say so frequently, and I hold myself most accountable to this because I say it so frequently, just because we have traumatic experiences, we have trauma responses, that does not remove the fact that we're accountable for how our behaviors impact others.
Yeah.
So my having a trauma response and engaging in behaviors, if I'm an executive and those behaviors therefore harm others, we're still accountable for those actions.
Yes.
And I think we can have, we can reflect on, folks who've harmed us and how they may have been harmed previously. And that's part of why their behavior is that way. So I've done some of that work personally, but I've also done the work where I've said, I think I may have harmed someone because I didn't manage this behavior well, this reaction.
Yeah.
And I'm still accountable for doing that harm.
Yeah.
And it's really tough to be in an executive level, to be leading teams and not have really dug in and addressed some of those things that are showing up. And some of them, I wrote an article a few weeks ago and it was like, is your people pleasing at work actually a trauma response? And a couple people responded to me like, I feel so called out right now. But it is, there are these behaviors that show up really frequently, and they can really undermine us or really harm those around us in the workplace.
Yeah, you have to send that to me. That's spot on.
I was calling myself out too, to be clear. But it's those behaviors unaddressed, it trickles down, and it is this ongoing snowball. When we talk about how do we actually get to a place where we're not talking about over 70% of adults identifying as having experienced one or more traumatic experiences in a lifetime. It's looking at how we can build systems and processes and cultures that support childhoods that aren't, riddled with childhood experiences or ACEs. And I love the point you make about these CEOs, these executives, because a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times these individuals are coming from a place of privilege at some level. And ACEs are really interesting because they impact every community. There's no community, there's no socioeconomic status that ACEs do not show up in. And I'm a big fan of Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's work around ACEs because she points this out so beautifully. And it points so well to, unfortunately, trauma is a common theme among any community. However, the differences are just going to shape how we experience that trauma and how we experience those reactions. And that's where, again, that intersectionality is so important.
And I suppose you can even think about, maybe this is a hard parallel, but it works for me, is an organization is kind of like a system, or, I don't like to use the term family in a family sense, but family in the sense that trauma can be cycled and passed around and perpetuated in different ways. And so if you're trying to build a trauma-informed or trauma-aware, trauma-responsive organization, it kind of takes everyone to be able to pinpoint and stop that cycle of trauma that they may be perpetuating. If it's just one person, but they're in the system of trauma, it's probably really tough, which is why you kind of need maybe you can start with leadership, but it's really the whole workforce that's rooted in the whole workforce that needs to have the tools and strategies to be able to identify and address trauma.
100%. Absolutely. And I mean, that's what I get to when I think we share the why, take a bite when you could eat the whole apple kind of approach to things we're passionate about. I'm interested in the systems and the processes and the culture because one leader who is kind of is traumatizing everyone they work with spreads out so quickly within an organization. And even if you're not, identifying as trauma, I'm sure folks can relate to one toxic leader or one toxic peer and how quickly they changed the entire environment. And I think it's so important for us to take the time and really, how do we address everyone? But certainly, leaders have outsized impact, so we often target them for good reason.
I have a question for you, and I hope hope we're doing okay on time. I've worked with a leader once in a consulting capacity around the George Floyd era, and it was a nonprofit, and a lot of people on the ground, the staff members, were like saying to this leader, like, hey, you're doing some really harmful practices and saying some really harmful things, and we feel a lot of harm coming from you. And he was, I think, maybe in his late 60s or early 70s, and he came to me, he's like, Steven, I don't get it. I didn't punch them in the face. What are they talking about with this like harm thing? He just came from a different generation where that harm meant something different to him than his younger workforce. Do you work with leaders to introduce them to this concept of what trauma and harm is and how you can perpetuate harm through a policy? It doesn't just mean physical harm.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, sometimes we like to pick on older generation, and I think we have to keep in mind, though, that a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot of what you talk about psychedelics, a lot of what I talk about trauma, this is new,
Mm.
relatively speaking.
Mm.
When we
There's
talk
cultural
about
things too.
yeah,
Mhm.
when we talk about the science, the research, information, how it's really entered, the zeitgeist, it's different. So someone who is, later in their career in their 50s or 60s, when you say the word trauma, they're probably thinking about a single traumatic, violent event, or perhaps a service member returning from an active war zone. That makes sense because that's what they grew up learning about trauma. And then you have Gen Z, love Gen Z. They talk about trauma on TikTok all the time. But like they almost use the term trauma colloquially. So how do we bridge that and actually say, hey, here's what trauma is? And that's always where I start with organizations. To be trauma informed, you have to first understand what trauma is and then be aware to the impacts of trauma on your workplace, yourself, society. And then there's the, action work of actively avoiding re-traumatizing survivors, and then actively avoiding doing harm. And so it's changing that. And I think part of the reason people are like, I don't know, Stephanie, people don't really want to talk about trauma at work. Like, hey, I get it. Part of that is because they're thinking about trauma in a, single event, tell me about your trauma way instead of the systems, the processes, the culture that can support everyone. It's so fast. I swear I always, schedule, I think, plenty of time for these conversations, and it's never long enough. I do want to make sure and give you a chance to share if someone is really interested in learning more about getting more curious about psychedelics, maybe they think they might be right for them. Where could they go to learn more? What would you recommend they do to learn more?
So many good resources out there and so many bad ones. So
Yes.
it's like, where do I point people to? My organization, MAPS, maps.org, maps.org is a great place to learn about psychedelics. And there's a lot of places from there that we send people to. I mean, it really just depends on what you're trying to know. In this context of psychedelic assisted coaching, there is a podcast out there that I recommend called Talking About Coaching and Psychedelics, which is a really great one. One of the podcast hosts is actually my coach as well. So, and he's been my coach for nearly a decade. So we go way back.
Amazing.
Before I was super active about psychedelics, and before he didn't tell his clients that he was into psychedelics, we found each other. So just kind of, it was meant to happen. Yes. So Talking About Coaching and Psychedelics is a really good podcast to listen to. Other than that, I would say I really push people to have conversations with their friends, loved ones, and family, just asking them what they think and what they know about psychedelics, and you would be surprised. Sometimes the people that are really, you think would be really against it, have a first degree connection to someone that's really benefited from it. And sometimes someone like, oh, they definitely do psychedelics, and they're like, I actually had a really difficult experience and I don't like to do it anymore. So it's really interesting to just have conversations with people and get various perspectives that way, whether they're positive or negative.
I love that. That's so smart. And then, of course, if people are interested in following along with your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, so setthesetting.com is my kind of professional website, but I don't update it that much, actually. The place where you really want to follow me is on Substack. If any of you use Substack, I have a blog with the same name, Set the Setting. And that's a more personal look into my life. There is some work stuff, but there's also memes and GIFs and playlists, and I think it's a little bit more engaging. Yeah, it's the one that I spend more time on. I write a monthly blog.
Amazing. Well, I love that. Steven, this has been such an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your knowledge and your voice. And I am so thrilled that we've been able to connect this year and look forward to staying connected and seeing the amazing work you continue to do.
thank you for doing the work that you're doing. And yeah, for having me on your podcast. This has been great.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all for listening in. Make sure and tune in next time. We've got more great conversations this season. And until next time, be well.